to me, that's one of the things that sets Tolkien and Lord of the Rings specifically at near the top of the pyramid in terms of just great works of fiction, right?
Yeah.
And it's so beloved because there's so much virtue in it, like from top to bottom, from character, and practically every character, the entire narrative, in a way that I can think of no other fiction book ever, manages to cram in every meaningful virtue.
Yep.
Right. It's just in there. And I think when you think about comparing that to Rings of Power, if you think about some of the characters in Lord of the Rings, you've got Aragorn, excuse me. So he was seeking justice. There was peace, honor. There's that nature of kingship. Samwise is a beautiful display of fortitude. Frodo has self-sacrifice, temperance, courage, wisdom. And I actually wrote an article about this a few weeks ago, and one of the things I say is, and it's really true about Lord of the Rings, and to me this is pretty comparison. If you're comparing Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power, the characters, or the good characters in Lord of the Rings, often do the right thing because it is the right thing as defined by God's law and moral code, objective moral code. Yeah. So even in the face of pure evil, and when the odds are stacked against them in every way imaginable, the characters maintain a deep conviction that goodness and providence will prevail over darkness and evil. And it's these virtues that I mentioned kind of offhand there, and several more that you could go on for a while about, that make this novel so influential, timeless, and epic. And again, it goes back to what you said: great stories, great narratives, the best of narratives somehow capture transcendent virtues and are inherent and just pregnant with goodness, truth, and beauty.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's really at the heart of why we have stories that will transcend culture and time, right? So you think of books like the Odyssey, Sophocles, the Greek tragedies, all that kind of stuff. There's elements within it. I mean, some of them are downright horrible stories, but in the midst of it, you can see just the the excellence even of the skill of these writers, where they can craft tragic stories in such beautiful ways and be able to turn a phrase or use a metaphor in such a brilliant way that it strikes at the heart of mankind. It reveals that human condition that I think we're all prone to, but it also, they can stumble upon some aspects of truth that God has just generally revealed to all mankind. Even though these are, pagan works in many ways, you have people that'll still stumble upon the truth of what God has revealed in nature, because that's just part of what God has done in natural law, Romans 1, right? So what I look at today, though, and especially as I thought of Rings of Power, is, I mean, literally we're in a unique time. We're in a weird day and age where much of what passes as entertainment today is just eye candy, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's absolutely, it's just eye candy. There's so little put out today has substance, and I think, and this is a point I wanted to touch on because it's specific to Rings of Power, but I think it's kind of true, generally true for most of entertainment today, because the culture largely, and I would say Hollywood, right, lumping them in that, because Hollywood, the entertainment culture, is not being built on a foundation of what I'll call Christian philosophy, right? This Christian worldview of creation, fall, redemption, because they're growing up in a world, these writers are writing novels, fiction, whatever it is, without a framework coming to it from a creation, fall, redemption, Judeo-Christian worldview. Because of that, it's fundamentally flawed. Like they lack the foundation that would be required to begin to how do I want to say it? They lack the foundation from their upbringing that would help them bring out these virtues in whatever it is they're creating. And I'll give you an example. So this is something I saw. I was reading some reviews and some guy said this, and I was like, that's a really good point. In some ways, because of that, Rings of Power, if I thought about it, was doomed to fail before it was ever made. And I think a lot of Tolkien people would say that, right? But one of the reasons is if you think about what the writers had to work with, and these are guys who are growing up in a postmodern materialistic worldview, likely. Tolkien, the Jackson trilogy had the actual benefit of having Tolkien dialogue from the books. Like, he could just put those in, and he did. Like, and I'll give you an example. One of the most beautiful lines, and if you just listen to it, it's poetic. You know, Frodo says, and this is a pretty famous line, he goes, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf replies with, "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that has been given to us." It's a beautiful line in the book, right? It's a very famous line. But Tolkien was one of the greatest linguists the world has ever seen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the guy literally wrote the Oxford English Dictionary.
He did. Yeah, exactly. Like, he was one of the greatest linguists. So you're going from a script that's being derived and built off a guy who is arguably the greatest linguist of all time, and or at least written one of the greatest books of fiction of all time, to guys coming in to write a script that have some loose outline from some appendices with no Judeo-Christian worldview going into it. So you get, on one hand, you have Tolkien giving Jackson beautiful poetry to work with, on top of an incredible narrative packed with transcendent virtues, to a room of guys in the Amazon basement writing things like,
"The sea is always
the sea
right.
is always right." Yeah. Like,
or
that's the comparison
right in the
here.
beginning. I can't remember Galadriel's brother's name, but he gives that horrible metaphor. I mean, it's literally a metaphor that doesn't work. About
the rock
and the
sink.
ship.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah,
that
I mean,
was.
you could change it out with any material known to man, and it would still make zero sense. But I'm like, if that's how you open this show, and that's your hook, right? That's how you're grabbing your audience. I'm like, good grief, this is just bad.
Yeah. But in some ways, I mean, I fault them because it's bad. But in another senses, it was doomed to fail from the beginning. Like, how can you compete with Tolkien?
Yeah.
Like, how can you compete with what Jackson had to work with? You just can't.
You can't.